Good morning, everyone. Hello. Thank you very much for coming to this press conference, which finishes off a four-day visit by EVP Dombrovskis, who is the European Commission Executive Vice President, responsible for trade and the economy. What we wanted to do is just give you an overview of this visit and, of course, also of the high-level economic and trade dialogue that we held yesterday. Some of our impressions, and we'll be very happy to take your questions. The EVP will give some introductory remarks, and then we'll go to your questions. We have just under an hour. Okay, EVP, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. This has been a very stimulating visit to China, which focused on two priorities. First, delivering EU's perspective on geopolitical developments. This is important to build understanding and set the right tone. Second, I have engaged closely and constructively with my counterparts to take stock of bilateral relations. We also explored options for EU-China cooperation on a global level. Yesterday, Vice Premier He Lifeng and myself chaired the 10th EU-China high-level economic and trade dialogue. This was a first opportunity for us to meet face-to-face to discuss economic, financial, trade and investment cooperation. We met at the time of rising geopolitical tensions and increased risks of global market fragmentation. We discussed challenges affecting our macroeconomic outlook. While the EU economy has shown remarkable resilience, wider economic trends are subject to many risks and uncertainties. China's economic performance is critical also for broader global economy. So I am pleased that we will soon resume our regular exchanges to discuss macroeconomic issues. We also discussed shared global challenges, and I convey to the Chinese leadership some key messages that are vital for our relations. I have been very clear in all my engagements that responding to Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not just an EU priority, it's a decisive factor for virtually all priorities at the present time. We believe Russia's aggression to be unprovoked, unjustified, illegal and barbaric. The war has caused a humanitarian crisis in Europe. We have given shelter to over 4 million war refugees from Ukraine. We are committed to supporting Ukraine to victory for as long as it takes. This is a sovereign and independent nation with clear and established territorial boundaries. Under international law, Ukraine is entitled to pursue whatever alliances it wants. It is in this context that it's difficult for us to understand China's stance. The war is a global disaster driving up food and energy prices. Russia's sabotage of grain exports from Ukraine weakens food security, hurting the developing world. Food security is also high on China's agenda. In my meeting with Vice Premier He Lifeng, I asked that we increase cooperation, aiming to bring back Black Sea Grain Initiative, working alongside with Turkey and United Nations. The war also weakens the global economy, which negatively impacts on China as an export-oriented economy. And China's position is affecting the country's image, not only with European consumers, but also with businesses. Over a third of EU companies in this country have indicated that China's position on the war is making it a less attractive investment destination. China's response and its contribution to resolving the war is a way that is important for us to engage. Let me now turn to trade and investment relationship. The EU-China trade relationship is one of the biggest in the world, and it's critical for both sides. The total trade in goods last year reached 857 billion euros. Yet European companies here are raising a number of concerns about the business environment. Addressing those would help China to retain its capacity to attract and retain foreign investment and meet the objective of a sustainable, high-quality economic development. The EU remains China's biggest export destination, and EU companies remain a substantial presence in the Chinese market. However, to continue on mutually beneficial paths, rebalancing is necessary. The current EU's trade deficit with China stands at nearly 400 billion euros. We also have real concerns about market access and other challenges. In a recent survey by the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, nearly 2/3 of respondents indicated that doing business has become more difficult. The business environment has become more political and less predictable. We have requested that our Chinese partners engage with us on these challenges. Specifically, we wish to see greater transparency, predictability, and reciprocity. In this context, we both agreed in our high-level economic dialogue to continue discussions on possible EU-China transparency mechanism on supply chains for critical raw materials. We have a number of areas where more work is needed. The agri-food sector, where we will still need to work towards recognition of so-called EU zoning rules or regionalization, so as not to hamper wider exports in case of localized animal diseases outbreaks. Furthermore, we needed to improve public procurement access for European medical devices. This is also for the good of Chinese citizens who should get access to best available healthcare technology. Another topic was infant formula. EU companies supply some 75% of China's market, but our companies are hitting hurdles. Following our discussions, we expect to see rapid progress in clearing up the backlog of applications for licenses. We also hope to lower the administrative burden and far-reaching disclosure requirements on European cosmetic products sold here in China, which we need to address, so we agreed to set a working group to address these issues. And let me touch briefly also on legal uncertainty related to data. This is causing real anxiety among European companies here in China, as new legal rules are making it very cumbersome to operate effectively. So we will build on the agreement reached earlier this month by European Commission Vice President Jourova and Vice Premier Zhang to provide clarity and facilitate compliance of EU businesses with Chinese data laws. Finally, I'm glad we managed to have insightful and positive discussion on financial services, setting up a new working group on financial regulation. Allow me to say a word about enhancing our multilateral cooperation. This includes engagement on debt relief efforts at G20 level and improving coordination in the World Trade Organization. The EU and China cooperate proactively on many WTO files, but we could do more together on overall reform. The EU is convinced that this is in China's direct interest because reform, well-functioning WTO can be a cornerstone for countries' growth and development. To conclude, I'm thankful to my Chinese partners for an engagement that has been both candid and useful. The EU is keen to translate this engagement into mutually advantageous results without delay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll go straight to your questions. I'm afraid I don't have the pleasure of knowing you all, so please introduce yourselves and the name of your media. Our colleagues will come around with a microphone, so please go ahead. Okay, first off the mark, we will go with CNBC, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Evelyn Cheng from CNBC. I have two questions. One is, what is your sense of the state of the Chinese economy from your conversations with the Vice Premier and the risk from the property sector? And then the second question is around the EU probe into subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles. How did the Chinese respond to that? How did it affect your ability to reach agreements with the Chinese side? Thank you.
Yes, indeed. So on first point on state of the Chinese economy, indeed, that was something we were covering in our high-level economic dialogue, where the first item on the agenda was macroeconomic issues. So we had exchange of views on economic developments in Europe, where it must be said that economic growth remains subdued this year. We expect economic growth of 0.8%. And we expect a mild rebound next year of 1.4% growth. And clearly the economic outlook is affected by Russia's war in Ukraine. As regards state of play of Chinese economy, we see a rebound from opening up from COVID-19 pandemics, but it's proving not as strong as initially expected, and indeed there are certain structural issues in Chinese economy to be addressed, including, as you mentioned, in real estate sector and concerning high indebtedness, notably on local government level. And all in all, there is a need for broader rebalancing of Chinese economy, stimulating the consumption side of the economy, so moving from the economic model, which is dominated by investments and exports, to the broad-based economic model. On the second question on our anti-subsidy investigation on battery electrical vehicles, indeed this topic was raised in pretty much all meetings with my Chinese counterparts, so we had opportunity to discuss it in depth. So there I had been providing clarity that the EU will be conducting this anti-subsidy investigation in full line with our EU rules and applicable WTO rules and principles. For anti-subsidy investigation, there are two elements which are important. So one is the presence on production side subsidies. And this is exactly what we are going to investigate, and where we will have also sufficient opportunity to engage with both Chinese administration and businesses. We had a broader discussion on subsidization of electrical vehicles because EU is also providing subsidies for electrical vehicles, and our intention is actually to phase out internal combustion engines by 2035 when they will no longer be allowed to be sold in the EU. So this move towards electromobility is taking place, but we provide subsidies on the consumption side. So we provide subsidies. Many EU member states provide subsidies when electrical vehicles are being purchased. But those are subsidies which are available to all producers. So it can be European or American or Chinese electrical vehicle. Consumer still gets a subsidy. So that's what distinguishes these consumption side subsidies from production side subsidies, which we are going to investigate. And a second important element for anti-subsidy investigation is risk of injury for EU industry, which we assess that it is there. In the last 2-3 years, share of Chinese brand electrical vehicles in the EU market has increased from less than 1% to 8%. And it has been like exponential growth, and clearly if it continues this way, there is a risk of injury for EU industry. So those are the elements which are behind this investigation, but as I outlined, it's going to be a facts-based investigation, fully in line with respective EU and WTO rules.
Thank you. We'll go to CMG, please. Thank you.
Hello, sir. My question is, to tackle climate change, the EU raises its target of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions at least 55% by 2030 and makes climate neutrality by 2050. So how will European cooperation with China in the field of new energy contribute to this goal? Thank you.
Indeed, as you already pointed out, in a context of European Green Deal, we aim to reach climate neutrality by 2050, and we have a 55% emission reduction target by 2030. And we are fully committed to those targets and implementing a wide range of measures across different sectors of economy to achieve those targets. And indeed, if we discuss addressing climate change, cooperation with China is indispensable, because China is the biggest emitter of CO2 emissions in the world. So to have a meaningful work towards addressing climate change, obviously we need China on board, and we are indeed actively developing this cooperation across different sectors, and we believe that the upcoming COP28 conference will provide also a good occasion to discuss our further respective steps on addressing climate change.
Okay, I'm going to go for Bloomberg next, then we'll move to the other side. Thanks.
Hi, James Baker from Bloomberg. A lot of the things you've been saying here on subsidies, on uneven access, the unlevel playing field, the trade imbalances, are something that the European business community has been saying here for many years. I mean, I've been here 5 years, and they've been saying this the whole time. And so there's been a real change in the rhetoric coming out of the EU. It seems to be, especially with this visit today, this time. Has there been a real change in how the Chinese are actually listening to that, though? Because while it seems that Europe is changing in how they view trade and investment and the economic relationship, did you feel that there was a change in how the Chinese are listening to that, how they're responding to that, and what the things they're going to do? I mean, their public rhetoric is just saying, China will continue with high-level opening up, and there hasn't been a real change in what they're saying. But in their discussions with you, did you sense a change in their attitude? Thank you.
First of all, I would say that it's not a question of a change of rhetorics, because there are facts which are changing. So the first, some observations worth noting as regards our trade deficit with China. Indeed, we for many years had been running trade deficit with China, and in the EU we are not seeing it as a zero-sum game, and we understand that in a global economy you cannot have perfectly balanced trade relationship with all countries in the world, and countries have different economic models. So in broad terms we see global trade as a win-win, but obviously the dramatic increase of trade deficit in recent years, as I was mentioning, reaching a whopping 400 billion euros, has made headlines and has forced us to take a closer look. So what is really behind that rapid increase in trade deficit? And second, you mentioned indeed concerns being raised by European businesses, but also there, just recently EU Chamber of Commerce in China published its latest survey, in which, as I was mentioning, 2/3 of companies are saying that doing business in China is becoming more difficult, and that's the highest number of companies saying so in recent future. So also there, it's worth looking what are the developments driving these concerns in the European companies, which seem to be increasing, not decreasing. So those are the issues we need to look and we need to address, and indeed that's why it has been emphasized from my side, from EU side more generally, that we need more balance and reciprocity in our economic engagements, and those are exactly topics which we were discussing with my Chinese counterparts during this visit.
Okay, let me go to the Global Times and then New York Times, please.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is that can you give a comments about the achievements that you think that made for this visit? And second, you talk about the financial cooperation that the two sides are hoping to push forward. So what are the potentials do you think that both sides can tap into in this sector? Thank you.
On the first question, I already, in my introductory remarks, mentioned the main outcomes of our high-level economic dialogue. So we are making some progress across a range of the issues, on some of the market access issues, on broader engagement with Chinese authorities, agreeing to set up specific working groups to also address specific issues and also discuss broader developments, macroeconomic developments, cooperation in financial sector. If we discuss specifically cooperation in the financial sector, as I was mentioning, indeed we had a positive exchange in yesterday's high-level economic dialogue, and we agreed to set up a working group on financial services, focusing on a number of issues, on the market access issues for the European financial sector companies, on cooperation in areas on green finances and fintech. It must be said that also my personal experience of engagement with People's Bank of China on the area of green finances has been a positive one. I have been working together with my Chinese counterpart for People's Bank of China on setting up international platform on sustainable finance, also on other initiatives in my previous portfolio when I was responsible for financial services. And so there is obviously the scope to broaden cooperation in this area. And we also agreed to discuss questions related to data flows in the area of financial services. I already made this point on broader data flows issues, but obviously for financial sector this is a particularly pertinent issue, and also for any financial services provider to be active internationally, whether it's Chinese or European company, to ensuring the data flows across the borders is key. Without this, it's very difficult to conduct to provide financial services across borders. So this data flows issues is indeed a critical issue, and there with the new data governance laws in China, including with anti-espionage law, there are new concerns which needs to be discussed, and indeed European companies need clarity how to address those data laws. There are also many concepts which are not sufficiently specified. For example, what constitutes important data, how it's determined, how those data flows are being ensured. So that's a new development, but we believe that's a development of systemic importance. So it's positive that we agreed to engage on this more broadly, but also specifically in the financial sector.
Keith Bradshaw, New York Times. Some in Germany have expressed discomfort with the idea of tariffs on cars through an anti-subsidy investigation, and have said that they would feel more comfortable with some effort to require or encourage more localization in Europe of the production of Chinese brand cars, so that Chinese companies would face the same costs as European companies. On the other hand, we also see Chinese shipyards on the Yangtze building in this enormous fleet of the largest car-carrying ships the world has ever seen, exactly to move more cars to Europe, which doesn't look like a plan for localization. So are you discussing, if not forced localization, then incentives for localization, even though under WTO rules since 1993, it's hard to force companies to localize? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. First, indeed, as you know, EU is not pursuing a policy of forced localization, and so as regards incentives for the localizations, well, I would say incentives, broadly speaking, for investing and producing in Europe. I think there are plenty of incentives with the EU providing a clear and predictable rules-based business environment in which companies have clarity what is expected from them and how to operate in the European market, and also the fact that EU has its own internal or single market providing access to all 27 member states regardless where the companies are located. So we believe that EU is attractive business location. When we discuss the question on production on electrical vehicles, well, that's exactly one of the topics which we need to address, because in EU, as you know, we have our state aid rules which are limiting the room of maneuver for member states to provide production side subsidies to its producers, be it electrical vehicles or any other sector. And if we have a limited room for maneuver from our own member states, of course we need to look at what is happening if we are faced with rapidly increasing imports from countries where there is more room for maneuver on delivering production side subsidies. That's exactly what we are currently doing.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Kaixing next, and then we'll go back to this side. Thanks. By the way, I can see a couple of you recording. Just to say, there will be video footage available of this press conference on EBS, which is the platform for the European Commission. And we will also publish the EVP's opening remarks. Okay, Kaixing?
Li Wei from Caixin. You articulated EU's stance on subsidy, on anti-subsidy investigation on say, production side, not consumption side, which seems very sensible. How does the Chinese side respond to this? And also, how do you think this issue will eventually be resolved in case it is determined as there is this kind of subsidy? I was talking to Pascal Lamy over the weekend. He was suggesting two things. It could be in a scenario in which there would be no tariffs, but like the earlier solar case, it could be price undertaking, so minimum export price to Europe undertook by Chinese solar companies. So now in this case, maybe Chinese EV companies. And the second thing he suggests that there could be give and take negotiation in other areas to make kind of eventual a good outcome on these subsidy or eventual avoiding tariff. How do you look at the potential outcome and progress in this area from your trip this time? Thanks.
Well, on the first part of your question, as I was mentioning, Chinese authorities obviously were raising this question and expressing their concerns about this. So I was providing the reassurances, as I said before, that this investigation is going to be conducted on a facts-based manner and in line with applicable EU and WTO rules. So it's important that we'll have occasions to engage with Chinese administration, with Chinese industry to clarify the facts, and so the outcome of investigation is going to be determined by those facts. So currently I cannot prejudge the outcome of the investigation, but in any case it's clear that we stand ready to engage with Chinese authorities and as we are moving forward with this investigation.
Okay, let me go to AFP. Thank you. And then NZZ. Thanks.
Thank you. I have two questions. First, you just mentioned the counter-espionage law. I'm wondering if that specifically came up in your discussions, and if so, how did those discussions go? And then secondly, you said yesterday that China's stance on Ukraine is affecting the country's image. I'm just curious, how does this affect the trade relationship, this geopolitical issue? How does it affect the trade relationship between Europe and China? At what point would the EU consider pulling away from China in terms of trade on this Ukraine conflict? Thank you.
So on the first point, during my visit in China, both in Shanghai and here in Beijing, I had a meeting with European Chamber of Commerce in China to discuss concerns of European businesses. So we didn't have like specific in-depth discussions on anti-espionage law, but it came in a context of broader data transfers and data-related issues. I was already talking about this in introductory remarks, and once again, just to reiterate that this may be issue of systemic concern, and it may affect all internationally active companies, not only European companies, but also Chinese companies, so there may be unintended consequences. So indeed that requires attention and engagement. So it's positive that we have this engagement now from Chinese authorities. So we agreed to build on the, as regards this data laws, on the agreement which was reached earlier this month with European Commission's Vice President Jourova and Vice Premier Zhang to set up a specific mechanism to provide clarity and to facilitate compliance with those data laws by European companies, and that's also one of the priority areas specifically in the topic on financial services. On the second question on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, indeed, as I was mentioning, I had been raising it with my Chinese counterparts on also informing how it's affecting China's perception in the EU and also among European businesses, and urging for more engagement, including on areas, as I was mentioning, the resumption of Black Sea Grain Initiative, because that's important first and foremost for the developing countries to ensure food security and food affordability, also for greater cooperation against sanctions circumvention and battlefield items reaching Russia and potentially battlefields in Ukraine. So in any case, we are seeking greater engagement with this on China, and also using this visit to provide, so to say, more input and clarifications on the EU position in this matter.
NZZ, and then we'll go to the back. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Matthias Kamp. I work for the Swiss daily newspaper NZZ. I want to come back to this EV subsidy probe by the EU. Would it be an option for the EU to only provide consumer-side subsidies for the purchase of EVs if the manufacturers actually produce their cars in Europe? Is that being considered?
That's something which I would say could be doubtful from the point of view of compliance with the WTO rules, also with a number of our bilateral trade agreements, because in this case those would be discriminatory subsidies and trade distorting subsidies. As you know, we ourselves had been raising extensively concerns with United States on their Inflation Reduction Act, where exactly this kind of subsidies linked with local content, local assembly requirements are being provided. As you know, we have found some halfway acceptable solution on this bilaterally with US. But we do not have intention to pursue this approach in the EU. So, but then, of course, while we are playing by the rules, we are expecting also others playing by the rules, and we need to be able to defend itself when we see presence of trade distorting subsidies in one form or another.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the back. CGTN there, please.
Thank you. This is reporter from CGTN, and I have two questions. The first one, you have called for fair composition, but actually currently the EU is launching probe into Chinese electric vehicles, and Beijing says it's kind of protectionism. So how do you see this kind of differences between the two sides? And the second one is about the China and the United States are launching two working groups on the economic fields. So will this in fact use a trade policy towards China? Thank you very much.
Yes. On the first question, first of all, EU is committed to open and fair rules-based international trade. We have always seen as part of it of our strengths, both the EU single market, where we have open market within 27 EU member states, and also our openness internationally. So, from that point of view, is clear that EU is not pursuing protectionist policies and is actually rejecting protectionism. But as I was mentioning before, when we discuss open trade, this open trade also needs to be fair. So if there is a presence of trade distortive measures, we need to be able to address those trade distortive measures. So that's the way how we are approaching the question of trade, and once again to come with a specific investigation, as I was mentioning several times before, is going to be conducted in line with applicable EU and also WTO rules, so in line with international practice in dealing with these kind of issues. As regards engagement in the area of economy, trade, finance, that's exactly what we had been doing in this high-level economic dialogue between EU and China, and we also agreed to form some new working groups on this engagement, resume the work of some other working groups like economic and financial working group and macroeconomic working group, because we think it's important to have this engagement with China, to have the discussions and to discuss things, how we can cooperate, but also to discuss our differences and the best ways to address them. And from that point of view, I think it's positive that US is doing the same, because we always believe that engagement is always better than confrontation. So it's best that we are engaging and finding solutions.
Okay, I'll take a couple more, and then we'll unfortunately have to move on. I'll go to the South China Morning Post, please. Thanks.
Good morning. Two questions. One is to follow up on China's response to your concerns voiced on Russia's war in Ukraine. You mentioned that you wanted China to help bring back the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I wanted to ask how their response is to this suggestion particularly. And secondly, to sum up from your trip, how would you describe how your attitude has changed, if any, towards formulating the EU's broader economic security strategy? And would you say you're more certain that de-risking is necessary? Thank you.
On the first question on Black Sea Grain Initiative, indeed that's something I have been urging my Chinese counterparts, including Vice Premier He Feng, for China to play a more active role, and I would say not only specifically on Black Sea Grain Initiative, but in a broader question of addressing food security and food affordability questions in the developing world, because this Russia's weaponization of food supplies and sabotaging of Ukrainian exports first and foremost is negatively affecting developing countries, and there obviously there is a scope of cooperation between EU and China, and that's recognized also by Chinese authorities. Then on the second question on economic security strategy, indeed, that was also one of the topics we were discussing in a high-level economic dialogue, where we used the occasion to provide the main elements of our economic security strategy, where what I was emphasizing that it will be targeted and precise, so the national security needs to be narrowly defined concept, so it cannot get excessively broad, but it's also clear that in a current more geopolitically conflictual context, we need to look also on the national security issues, economic security issues, address our strategic dependencies, like the one we had, for example, on Russian fossil fuel supplies, notably natural gas supplies, so something we had to unwind last year, but then of course it's important that we are reassessing the situation and making sure that we do not end up in other over-dependencies in the future.
Okay, I'll go to Ansa next. Thanks for your patience, Ansa.
Hi, Antonio Farigoso for ANSA Italian News Agency. So, as you pointed out during your trip to China, the European Union has a huge trade deficit, so almost 400 billion euros. So my question is, how do you think it's possible to fix the problem, considering that almost 10 years of tariff war launched by the US didn't solve the situation on the US-China bilateral trade relations?
Well, first of all, as I was outlining already before, we do not see a trade deficit per se as an issue. As I say, we are not pursuing balanced trade with all countries in the world. We know the international economic flows, international distribution of labor, if you want, which obviously results in also different trade balances which we are running in different countries. So this is not the aim per se, but obviously when the trade deficit has been exploding in recent years, we have to look. So what are the reasons and what needs to be done to address. So therefore one part of the answer is that we are not seeking to eliminate trade deficit or do not necessarily see trade deficit as something which is bad per se, so that's not something we are focusing on. Second, we are looking what are the reasons for a recent increase, and there are numerous, and one of the elements which we can address is exactly the questions of market access issues, sector by sector, where we see that in a number of sectors, in terms of our respective levels of openness of our markets, EU's market is more open to Chinese goods and companies, and China's market is to European goods and companies. So that's why we had quite extensive discussions in our high-level economic dialogue, specifically on those market access issues. And in introductory remarks, I was also telling so what kind of specific deliverables or agreements we now have from this high-level economic dialogue, but clearly these issues will continue to be high on our agenda. So we are seeking more reciprocity in our relations, and we think that also will provide for more balanced overall relations.
Okay, I think we're going to have to probably wrap up. I'll take one very last one. I saw Phoenix earlier, but I'm not sure they were there. Okay, then I will go with NRK. Thank you.
Thank you. Philip Lowe from the Norwegian Broadcasting. One question about the upcoming Belt and Road Summit and the current geopolitics. Is the EU still interested in engaging with the Belt and Road, or is the interest fading, and is the EU looking at alternatives? And what do you make of President Putin's presence at the upcoming summit?
First of all, we know that Belt and Road Initiative is Chinese flagship initiative as regards infrastructure developments globally. I would say we have our own initiative, which is a global gateway initiative, which we are pursuing from the EU side. But obviously, when we discuss infrastructure developments, when we discuss engagement with developing countries, there is scope for cooperation between EU and China. I was mentioning also initially some of areas of engagement to support developing countries like G20 debt relief initiative, so to address indebtedness, and also we are seeking new forms of cooperation and new forms of facilitating infrastructure development, including in developing countries. So definitely there is scope for discussion how our flagship initiatives are interacting.
Thanks very much. EVP.
As you are aware from the EU side, our position is very clear against Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and President of Russia Putin responsibility of actually starting this war. So I think that frames our thinking on this issue.
Okay, sorry folks, we have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much for coming this morning. And if you have any follow-ups, etc., our excellent press team led by Patricia is available to you. Thank you all. Thanks, EVP.